Hi guys, and welcome back to the Bird Photography Show with Glenn Bartley
Hello.
and me, Jan Wegener.
And you might notice that this week we have a special guest with us, Mr. Duade Payton, Australian photographer, YouTuber, and we're super happy to have him here with us.
Yeah, thanks Glenn, thanks Jan for having me on. It's taken a while, but I can't wait to have a chat.
So Dwight, we saw that recent video you posted where you had like a traumatic near-death experience, and that actually got you into bird photography. We thought that was quite a interesting story. Maybe you can share a bit more about it.
I guess we all have a story, don't we, of how we find things. Like I had no interest in birds or photography whatsoever up until about 11 years ago. If you watch my video, you know I had a cardiac arrest where my heart stopped and I sort of spent a lot of time in hospital. And when I got out of hospital, the doctor said I needed to walk around. So I started walking around the local area. And as you do when you're walking through the bush, you sort of notice a few things. And I obviously noticed some birds. And I thought, that's pretty cool. And at the time, my wife actually had this exact camera. She had the Canon 40D that she took photos of jewelry. So I grabbed the 40D and I had a 70 to 200 at the time for people and things. So I just went for a walk with that, and I think a magpie landed on a fence post, put up the camera, took a photo, and I just wanted to know what the birds were I was seeing. So I grabbed, a bird book, and it snowballed from there. I just started seeing birds, and I don't know what triggers these things in us. Like, I don't know why we like what we like, but when we do, we know. And I think with birds, it was just instant. I knew straight away that, oh, wow, I'm really enjoying this.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Duade. I mean, I think we've all felt that, or you're lucky if you've felt that feeling where you find something that you're passionate about and you don't know when it's going to come, you don't know what it's going to be, but you have that certain feeling and you're like, I really like this. And a lot of times I think it comes down to this sort of feeling where time just stops, you sort of just forget what you're doing, you're completely in the zone, just focusing on this thing that you've found that you really enjoy. And I think that's, for me at least, one of the things about bird photography that I really enjoy, that sort of just respite from the rest of the world.
And I made the mistake of actually looking at both of your works. I went on the internet and I looked up, bird photography, and here's Jan, here's Glenn, and here's these amazing photos, and I'm going, oh, mine are terrible. Mine are really bad. I thought, oh, gee, what do I need to do? So I just started to do a lot of research, and I joined a few forums, and 11 years later I'm here talking to both of you, so that's how I got started.
That's awesome. And so you weren't interested in birds at all before you grabbed your camera?
I don't know how to explain it, to be honest.
Now that's really interesting, because that's basically the opposite to me. I always had this sort of interest in birds, and then over time kind of combined with photography. I didn't really have any proper camera. I just had this like little bridge camera. Parrots and cockatoos have always fascinated me the most. Not many around in the wild in Germany, so the only spot to go to was the zoo. It was a good learning experience, and I think it's also a good thing to just remember that you don't always have to go really far if you want to just learn your camera, get out there, just photograph what's around you. And the most annoying thing back in the day was really that these little bridge cameras that I had, like the battery life was just atrocious. It was like less than 10 minutes per 4-pack of AA batteries. So there's little Jan, I was maybe like 15 or 16, had like a full backpack of batteries going through the zoo, always turning off the camera because it would just run out of battery. So an interesting experience, but that's really what got me started.
So I guess I'm kind of in the middle of you two guys, because I was always kind of interested in nature as a kid, but then I never really was specifically interested in birds, although there is some story of me laying under a hummingbird feeder when I was like a little kid trying to photograph these hummingbirds, which is kind of funny because that became one of the main sort of subjects that I've kind of gotten known for. For me, the real catalyst to becoming a nature photographer was, funnily enough, a trip to Australia. I got an opportunity to do a semester abroad during my undergraduate degree in Brisbane. I'm gonna have to have a camera. I mean, I can't go there for 6 months and have no camera. And I bought a film camera. I still remember it was a Canon Elan 7, pretty good little camera. Sort of 75 to 300 millimeter kit lens and a little wide angle kit lens and a crappy tripod, and off I went. And on that trip, I wasn't like focused on birds, although it was really interesting to start to see some of the Australian birds. But that was the real tipping point that got me kind of going into the world of nature photography, and very quickly I funneled in on birds.
So Dwight, you basically already started off with a professional camera right away because your wife had that 40D, but obviously I think you said there was like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens that probably didn't last you too long as your main bird photography lens.
I made the mistake, as we all do. I bought a 2x converter for the 70 to 200 first. I thought, oh, easy, I can just buy a 2x and I've got 400 millimeters. And I bought, I think, a version 2 2x, put it on this version 1 70 to 200, and the results were just terrible. They were soft. I just couldn't get sharp shots, and I'm thinking, oh no, it's me. I don't know what I'm doing wrong here. And thankfully, somebody's told me that you've wasted your money on that. You shouldn't have done that. Anyway, so I did a lot of research. At the time, the only real two options I had were the 100 to 400 version 1 and the 400 5.6. They were sort of in my price bracket, I think around 1,200 Australian maybe at the time. So I decided to do all the research, and I ended up just going with the 400 5.6, which I still have. And people know that I love this lens, and it's just so sharp, it's so light, great for bird and flight. And I bought this and everything changed. As soon as I put this lens on this 40D, the whole world opened up, and I was like, oh wow, these photos are actually sharp. This is amazing. Obviously I still had a lot to learn, but now that my photos were sharp, that's when I sort of rolled on from there. And I just couldn't stop, honestly couldn't stop going out. And every opportunity I had, I would go out into the field to try and improve my images. And thankfully over time, as I spent that and learnt, it improved. So I'm curious to know what you guys started with.
Came across this 20D camera, and then I think I talked to my parents for most of the year, and actually all my relatives put some money in together, so I got that for Christmas. I think it was, I don't know, maybe like 15 or something, because I couldn't have afforded it back then. I was still going to school and stuff, so I'm very grateful for that. Now I had this camera, but the only lens I had was my mum's 70 to 300 kit lens she bought way back with her like proper SLR film camera, and I quickly realized that that also doesn't work very well. So eventually I started to do like an apprenticeship, saved some money, and I got the 100 to 400 version 1, that very interesting push and pull zoom. So that's kind of what got me started and got me to take some more nicer images of birds in the field, because now you could walk around 400 on 1.6 crop factor of the 20D gets you to like 640 millimeters. So that's at least a decent focal length if you want to photograph some birds in the field.
I date myself, predating you guys here, because my first digital camera was the 10D.
Wow.
Which was really the first kind of actually affordable DSLR. I saved up a bit of money, and by then the first kind of used DSLRs were getting on the market. So maybe the 20D was out, which meant that some people were selling off their 10Ds.
Yeah.
So I was able to pick one up for a reasonable price. And then, just like you guys mentioned, you then realize the next limitation is, of course, your lens. You really need to get to that sort of effective 600 millimeter kind of range to start feeling like you can actually approach birds and get some decent shots of some of the more confiding birds, the bigger birds, the shorebirds, things you can sneak around on the ground up to and get close to. But at sort of 70 to 300, especially on a full frame or a film body, it's not long enough. I found a 300 f4 locally used for a good price, and then I picked up a 1.4 converter, which actually works quite well with that lens. So that was my first kind of decent kit, and all of a sudden, the doors start opening up. You can actually take some decent photos, and you can see the potential, and it just reels you right in, because now not only are you interested in birds and interested in photography, you can actually get some decent results.
What I noticed there is that we all shoot Canon. Why is that? I'm interested to know why you guys chose Canon over Nikon or any of the other brands.
My mum had this Canon camera. I thought if I buy a Canon camera, I can also use some of those lenses. Whenever I talk to people, they said Canon 20D, and I think that's just what I went with it. And it just came out, so I was kind of just all the advertising, all the hype kind of getting to me, so I didn't really look at any other brands.
Yeah, I mean, for me, to be honest, I was 100% torn, despite what some of you might think based on my recent comments about Nikon cameras. And I remember going back to that little camera shop and, you know, trying the Canon and going around the store with it. And to me, the Canon honestly just felt so much nicer in my hand.
Imagine what could have been if you chose Nikon back then. We would have to rewrite the whole history, basically. How did you go from your first magpie photo to winning the BirdLife photography competition and the trip to like sub-Antarctica?
There are a lot of things that helped me when I started out. The first one is probably mentors, to be honest. So I reached out to a few local photographers, and they were very kind and willing to share their time with me. And that was Hein de Kock and Matt Jones. And I remember my first session where I joined them at the beach. We went to the beach, and they both got down on their bellies into the mud, and I'm thinking, what are these guys doing? Why are they laying, their cameras are like going to get dirty? You know, I didn't even think of this. So, but of course I just followed them and did what they did, and over time I just really improved. So having a mentor, seeing a different point of view, getting help from them was just huge for me. And the second thing for me was the forums back in the day prior to social media. I'm sure we were all part of these discussion boards. I joined a forum, and I think you were on there, Jan, when I joined, and I was seeing all these amazing images, and you could put your own image on and get some real constructive criticism. So, you know, you and all these other wonderful photographers were giving me all this individual feedback, and it really helped me. So that sort of kick-started, and I just obviously over time just improved.
It's probably a little bit harder now these days, because if you post on Instagram, it's not very likely you're going to get any sort of feedback or constructive criticism. I started very similar to Duade. Back then I was on certain forums, and there was just people that I really enjoyed seeing their photos. I had the same exact experience. We were also on the beach photographing shorebirds. We finally see some, and then he just grabs his camera and like jumps in the mud. I'm like, whoa. It's like really cold here. What are we doing? Why are we jumping in these freezing cold waters? Of course, I did it as well. I'm like, okay, if that's what you have to do. And then we took these photos. I underexposed them all horribly. They're like almost black because we're photographing these white birds. And he's like, we have to underexpose a little bit to not blow the highlights. I'm like, oh, I'm not going to blow anything on this bird. But it's literally a sandling, and you can only like kind of make out the shape of the bird because I was like 3 stops under. And I remember the whole day I'm saying, oh yeah, man, it's so bright, I have to underexpose so much, you know, like, oh, now I look back at these photos, I'm like, oh, terrible. But that's how I learned, because I looked at his images, I'm like, oh, they're not quite as dark as mine. Seeing people do things and then copying their good behaviors is definitely something that has helped me along. Everyone puts in a lot of work, and there's a lot of tricks or knowledge that you need to get to actually find the birds. You have to learn to see the birds. Like, so oftentimes you're out there photographing a bird, someone else walks past you, they don't even see this massive bird sitting right in front of you that you're photographing.
I have to admit, that's one of the worst things, Jan, is when someone walks up behind you and scares the bird away. How many times does that happen?
Too many.
Too many to count, yeah. No, I think you guys have made some good points, like, I mean, around trying to find mentors or those sort of, like Jan said, it's hard now, but in the days past, it was for sure some of those photo forms. But even if you're not interacting with a person or a messaging board, just, I think actually what's really important early is just even understanding what makes a good bird photo. So for me, I think it's really important for new photographers to look at lots of pictures. And I'm not going to tell you what you should like or what you shouldn't like, but you should know what you like and what you then are striving to create. And then you can start to deconstruct that and say, okay, what type of equipment might this person have had? How close were they? What were the techniques they were using? What was the light doing? All of these types of things. Because honestly, when you get started, you don't even know what you're trying to create. And that's a real problem for a lot of people when they're getting started.
I have to say, a shared experience is always a good one as well. Like, I know the times we've been out, Jan, you know, we have so much fun. Even though you drag me around for hours, we still have a lot of fun. You know, I really do enjoy that shared experience with another person, that's for sure.
Yeah, I forced him to take really nice photos of Gang cockatoos.
Well, those are some great points. Let's just cover a few other things before we move on here, of things that can definitely help you to become a better bird photographer. Understanding light is critical, of course, to all types of photography, and that's something you really have to learn to see light and to understand light, that it has direction, it has quality, it has intensity, it has color, all these things. And that's quite novel when you're not a photographer. Obviously, also very important to understand your camera. We've talked a lot about it, that you should be able to control your camera, you know, really without looking at it. And obviously, when you just buy a camera and you've never used any other cameras, especially from that brand, that's not going to be happening. But the more time you spend in the field, the more you should get really familiar with your camera, and that's going to definitely help you.
I think the other really important thing is to go to somewhere where there's birds. Go to like a town park or a lake or somewhere where there's tame birds, and that's how you really test your gear. Like I did a video recently where if you've got good light that Glenn mentioned and you can get really close to that bird, kind of testing your gear to see what's possible, what is the very best sharpness, what can I get? And pelicans and ducks and all these sort of tame birds, that's how you learn, and that's how you know what's possible with your gear.
And it's more fun. It's way more fun when you're getting great results right out of the gate. Like, you don't want to take some new photographer and be like, well, we're going to photograph this critically endangered species that no one's seen in the last 6 years. Like, that's not going to be enjoyable.
No, you need good results when you start out to not be too discouraged. And just seeing and watching tame birds is also how you learn bird behavior. You know, like if this duck's like bathing and shaking, it's probably going to do a wing flap now, for instance. So for the rest of your life, you'll know whenever it does a certain thing, I have to get ready because I might get the pulse with the good wings.
Don't get discouraged either. Like, we've given you all these great tips, and when I started out, I just went out in the field a lot. I had a quick look at my folders and I went out 106 times in my first year. Like 400 hours, I got my camera, went out into the field and just started taking photos. And it was with all that effort and all that time that my photos started to improve.
What do you guys find the most difficult when you started out in bird photography, or maybe you're starting out in bird photography right now? Is it finding the time to go out? Is it finding the birds? Is it getting close to the birds? Or is it just working with the gear? Or is it the good old mix of everything? Let us know in the comments, what are your challenges when it comes to bird photography?
I think you missed one there, Jan. I think you missed something. For me, when I started, it was editing. Like, I had no idea when I started, and it was a real trouble to try and figure out how to do it. I ended up with Lightroom, Photoshop, and struggled through it.
Let's be honest, Photoshop is not the most user-friendly program. These days, we've got a lot of great resources. You can always go to those ebooks of mine. Jan's got a fantastic masterclass, and as of very recently, we've come out with our PROSETS, which we really think will help save you time and get you great results in the digital darkroom.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the PROSETS. Thankfully, you guys did allow me to use your PROSETS, and I do use them, and I'll be honest, I use them. There's as a jack of all trades, more contrast. That's definitely, for my processing style, it just sort of strips away, you know, and it just gives me a good base to start on, and then I can work from there.
And also save time. Like, the huge thing is, like, you could probably get there eventually if you just studied Photoshop and put tons of time in and watched a million YouTube videos. But when it comes to, like, I find with bird photography, it's pretty specific what you need to know, and it's maybe 2% of what you can do in Photoshop that you actually need to know. But by streamlining that and just learning those things, it's so much more satisfying when you can just get a good result and improve your image and then present your work as good as it could be.
I do the same process pretty much every time, and there's only certain images which take longer, but the majority of the time I'm just following these steps.
So if you can read an ebook or watch a 2-hour video and basically be able to edit your photos to perfection right afterwards, it's a no-brainer essentially. So now we all shared what we started out with 15, 20 years ago. Some of these lenses are still around and you could still buy them, but it's probably not what we would choose anymore if we started out today. So what are some of the kits that you two would want to start out with if you're in that same position, but just fast forwarded, let's say 15 years. So what's the kit today?
For me, I guess it really just comes down to affordability or my budget. Like, it really depends how much money I want to spend on bird photography, because new kits are just so expensive. And I think there's a couple of options. I think the first one that people need to consider is like the super budget. I've done a few videos using the 40D and the 400 5.6. You can probably pick this kit up for maybe 600 US used. And even with this kit, you're going to take some amazing shots. I've had a lot of fun with this kit, so definitely affordable. If I was starting personally, and maybe I had, say, a $2,000 budget, I think I'd be pretty tempted to go with maybe a Nikon D500 and a Sigma 150-600. That's probably the kit that I would grab. That's a great body, and the lens gives me plenty of focal length. That's probably what I'd start with.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. It really depends on your budget. I remember, like, I mean, literally, like, scrimping pennies. Before that trip to Australia, I was so unbelievably cheap trying to save up money. And so, you know, the talk of like an extra couple $100, let alone a couple $1,000, was just not at all accessible to me as a student at that time. So it does really depend on your budget. But there's one thing that's for sure, is that if you are starting out and you are trying to save money, that the best way to do that is to buy used equipment. You can save so much money on used equipment, especially if you're not trying to buy the latest and greatest stuff. These days, there's thousands, millions of old DSLR cameras on the market, And all you need to do is find a way of picking up a decent used body, and then the more important thing is the lens, because the lens is something that you're thinking, how long might I keep this for? So I totally agree with you. I think the best bang for buck starter lens on the market today is probably that Sigma 150 to 600. I think that gives you that really nice reach, especially if you're getting a crop body, whether it's a Nikon 1.5 or a Canon 1.6. You've got almost 1,000 millimeters, and you can hit the ground running, just immediately starting to get decently close to birds and getting some great results. Don't forget that it's not just a camera and a lens. You're probably going to need a tripod, you're going to need a backpack, you're going to need more batteries, you're going to need memory cards. We all know how it goes. So save some money off to the side for those things.
Now I know that, Jan, you're not really a budget type of guy. I'm interested to know what you'd be looking at for yourself.
I was just thinking when you guys are talking, would I be happy if I bought a 7D? Now, if I knew nothing else, maybe, but I know that I would be definitely drawn to that sort of mirrorless technology. One lens that would have definitely caught my eye back in the day would be the Canon f11 800mm lens. If I think I have that little lens, 800mm, and definitely if you're doing a full frame, you want 600mm lens. So I would have probably back in the day saved up for an R6 and an f11 800mm lens. Another option could be the RF 100 to 400 f8 lens, although it's probably a little bit short on a full frame camera, but you made a video about that one recently. Do you think that would be a good option to start out with as well, Duade?
It really depends. I think, like I said in my review, this is the lens. This is how small it is. This is the RF 100 to 400. It's really affordable. I think it's like 700 US. It really comes down to your style, to be honest. This is sort of a jack of all trades with macro, landscapes, birds. It's too short on a full frame body for birds most of the time. So you would need this and an 800. That would make a really good combo. Or if Canon come out with maybe a 30 megapixel R7, if they ever do, then that would give you sort of 640. So, you just have to consider that. I don't think, we always underestimate how close we need to get to birds. You really need 600 to 800 millimeters effective focal length for birds, in my opinion.
I think another brand we would have probably been quite tempted by these days is like a Micro Four Thirds camera, like one of the Olympus bodies with like an f4 300mm lens or a 100 to 400mm lens. I think that would have been quite an affordable, lightweight combo, and in terms of ability, I think it's pretty good.
I think the other thing we can't lose track of is with lenses, at least, they do hold their value pretty well. Like cameras seem to lose their value quickly, but certain lenses hold their value. Like this 400 5.6, I've had this coming up 12 years, and I think I paid 1,200 for it, and I could probably get 800 Australian secondhand. So it hasn't lost that much money.
If you're just starting out, you're not sure, is bird photography for me? A used DSLR camera on the cheap, but maybe 50 to 100,000 shutter actuations for $500, $800 with a used 150 to 600 or 5.6 400mm lens is definitely the best way to get a feel of, do I like this? Do I want to pursue this? And then you can obviously go and spend some more money if you know that you actually want to pursue it. And there's one more lens I think we should talk about that we all love, the Sony 200 to 600mm lens. So if you wanted to get into the market and future-proof yourself, I would think that's a great way. For under $2,000, you buy this lens, you would most likely keep this for the rest of your life. So if you talk value for money, this lens is through the roof, and you just have to find a decent price camera body with it. Maybe an A7 III, and I think that's probably the biggest obstacle at the moment in entering the mirrorless market, that there's not that many sort of budget mirrorless cameras.
Yeah, totally agree. That Sony 200 to 600 is an amazing lens. I'd love to own one, to be honest. If Canon made it, I'd buy it in a heartbeat.
Well, we've talked a lot about getting started in bird photography, and before we let our special guest Duade go, we've got a few questions we want to ask you. So the first one, which is the obvious one that everyone always asks everyone who's a bird photographer, Duade, what is your favorite bird that you've ever photographed in your life?
It's a great question. It's hard to narrow it down, to be honest. I just love all sorts of birds. For me personally, I've got a soft spot for shorebirds. So shorebirds, I just love them. And I'd have to say the red-necked avocet for me. That bird is just absolutely stunning. The way that it looks, it feeds, it's so unique with its bill, its elegance. You can just lay in the mud and watch this bird all day. So it's definitely a red-necked avocet for me.
You've recently talked about a book project that you finished for a friend that passed away, unfortunately. Have you been working on some other project, or was that like one of your key projects you've been working on lately?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Jan. Yeah, obviously, I happen to have it here. The book that I worked on.
They're already sold out. This is one of the rare copies.
There's a couple popping up on book depositories, so just check that out. But yeah, the demand's been overwhelming, so I do appreciate all that support, and I'm very, very proud of that book and happy that Matt's legacy will live on. In terms of projects, I'm just happy to be doing YouTube, to be honest. I'm just going to continue rolling out the videos. I'd love to get back to New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand, and I really want to get back there and take some photos and film some video there. So that's sort of my goal.
What is one piece of equipment that you use in the field that's not your camera or your lens that you consider to be really important or essential to your photography?
This one's pretty easy, to be honest, and it's something that I bought a long time ago, and that was a skimmer ground pod. That thing just changed my life. Like, when I got that, I actually used a frying pan to begin with, and I just put my camera on top of the frying pan and just pushed the frying pan along just to get you down low. But it's an expensive bit of kit, but that skimmer ground pod, I can just put my gimbal on that, I can just push it through the mud. It just helps me, it's light, I just use that all the time. So definitely that skimmer ground pod is something I wouldn't go without.
So if you weren't convinced yet, now you truly know that Duade loves playing in the mud.
Definitely.
All right, guys, that wraps up today's episode of the Bird Photography Show with our awesome guest, Duade. Thanks for coming here. Make sure to also subscribe to his channel. We link it down there in the description. And while you're at it, also subscribe to this channel. Give us a thumbs up for this video and let us know in the comments what was your first kit of bird photography gear. Do you have any recommendations for other people? Let us know, and we will see you in our next video very soon. Bye, guys.
See ya.
See you next time, everybody.